Brigadier General Evelyn Shaw is standing no more than 10 feet from me, her dress uniform sharp as a blade, the courtroom windows throwing white morning light across the metals on her chest. My mother is in the second row, one hand still wrapped around the strap of her purse, as if she can hold herself upright by force. The judge has not spoken yet. No one breathes. Then General Shaw turns, looks straight at my mother, and says, "Mrs. Mercer, do you have any idea who your father really was?" A year earlier, I was sleeping in my childhood bedroom beneath a ceiling fan that clicked every third turn. I was 33 years old. I had come home to Richmond after a contract job ended, and a short, ugly engagement collapsed within the same month. I told myself it was temporary. My mother, Denise Mercer, never used the word temporary. She used words like drifting, unserious, wasting yourself. She said them in a low voice, almost politely, which somehow made them land harder. The room still smelled faintly of old paperback glue and cedar from the chest at the foot of the bed. My high school track medal hung where I had left it years before, tarnished now, ribbon curled. Every morning I would wake to the sound of cabinet doors opening downstairs and know, even before my feet touched the floor, that I was already behind in that house. My grandfather, Daniel Mercer, had died 6 days before the fight. He was my mother's father, though you would not have known it from the way she spoke of him. She called him difficult, private, impossible to read. My Aunt Linda called him cold. I knew a quieter man. He smelled like pipe tobacco he never lit anymore, and lemon oil from the rag he used on old wood furniture. He spoke in full sentences. He sharpened pencils with a pocket knife. He never hurried in answer. He never corrected anyone unless it mattered. When I was 12, I asked him why he folded his undershirts so neatly even though no one saw them. He said, "Because I see them." That was Granddad. Quiet does not mean small. I learned that from him long before I had words for it. After the funeral, the family gathered in my mother's dining room around a hem. No one really ate. The plates cooled. The iced tea sweated rings into the table. My aunt talked about probate before the pie was cut. My mother kept stacking and unstacking forks. I had a letter in my jacket pocket that had arrived 2 days before Granddad died, addressed in his careful block handwriting. I had not opened it at the table. Something in me wanted to keep one thing untouched. When everyone else left, I stood at the kitchen counter and slit the envelope with a butter knife. Inside was a single key, heavy brass, attached to a faded blue tag. There was also a note. "Caleb, if you are reading this, I ran out of time. Go to Savannah. Ask for Eleanor Price. Bring the ring. Do not discuss this in a crowded room. Granddad." I read it twice. Then a third time. "The ring?" my mother asked, and I looked up. She was standing in the doorway, dish towel in her hands. I reached into my other pocket and took out the signet ring Granddad had given me the previous Christmas. Sterling silver, worn smooth at the edges, with a small crest pressed into the face. I had thought it was old family sentiment. Nothing more. My mother laughed once through her nose. Not kindly, he was doing that again, she said. Leaving scavenger hunts and little mysteries, so everyone would orbit him. He asked me to go to Savannah. And do what? I don't know yet. She set the towel down very carefully. "Caleb, you are 33 years old. I know how old I am." "No. I don't think you do. Because serious people do not build plans around cryptic notes from dying men. It's his note. It's nonsense." The kitchen light was too bright. I remember that. It flattened everything. Her face. The pale counter. The bowl of fruit going soft near the window. I said, "I'm going." Her mouth tightened. Then she gave the smallest shrug, the one she used when she wanted to make contempt look reasonable. "You're not serious," she said. "If this is what you're doing now, get out." There are sentences that echo because they confirm a fear you already carry. That was one of them. I packed that night. 2 duffel bags. My laptop. A framed photograph of Granddad and me on a fishing pier when I was 8. I slept in a roadside motel outside Petersburg with the air conditioner rattling like loose teeth, and before I turned out the light, I put the ring and the brass key on the nightstand and stared at them until dawn. The next morning I drove south. Savannah was warm in that heavy coastal way that clings to your shirt by 9 in the morning. The air smelled like brick, wet leaves, and river salt. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks in long gray curtains, moving just enough to make the squares look haunted in daylight. I found Eleanor Price on the second floor of a narrow law office off Bull Street, where the waiting room held 2 hard chairs, a brass lamp, and a grandfather clock that had stopped at 4:12. Attorney Eleanor Price was in her 60s, with silver hair pinned back and a voice so precise it seemed to leave square corners in the air. "You're Daniel Mercer's grandson," she said, not asking did I nod it. She looked at the ring in my hand before she looked at me.
"Good.
He said you'd bring it." She led me into her office and closed the door. On her desk sat a thick file bound with a red band, a property photograph, and a sealed envelope with my name on it. I asked, "Did he leave me something?" She folded her hands. "He left you responsibility." That was not what I had expected, and she seemed to know it. "Your grandfather established the Mercer Preservation Trust 16 years ago," she said. "Its primary asset is a residence in Savannah's historic district. The current appraised value is just over $4 million. I thought I had misheard her. The room was quiet enough for me to hear the old vent ticking in the wall. "I'm sorry," I said. "A residence?" "Yes. My grandfather owned a $4 million house." "He did." I sat back hard enough that the chair creaked. "There has to be a mistake." "There is no mistake." She slid the property photograph toward me. It showed a pale gray mansion with black shutters, a wrought iron balcony, and a brick walk leading through a garden half hidden by old camellias. It looked less like a house than a memory someone with money had decided to preserve forever. My first thought was not pride. It was confusion. Granddad had lived in a plain brick ranch house outside Fredericksburg with cracked driveway concrete and a refrigerator that hummed louder than it cooled. Eleanor saw the question before I asked it. "He rarely stayed there," she said. "He paid for restoration, taxes, and maintenance through the trust, but he treated it as stewardship, not display."
"Why?"
She looked at me for a moment, as if deciding how much of Granddad's silence she was entitled to break. "Because he believed some things should outlast the people who benefit from them." I swallowed and asked the practical question because the practical question was the only one I could carry. "Why am I here?" "Because your mother and aunt have contested the trust." The words arrived flat and hard. "On what grounds?" "They claim Daniel Mercer lacked capacity. They further allege undue influence. In simpler terms, they are saying he was not in his right mind, and that someone, possibly you, pressured him." I laughed once. It sounded ugly in that room. I hadn't even been here. "I know," Eleanor said. "That is why we are going to proceed carefully." She opened the sealed envelope with my name and took out one sheet. "Your grandfather left specific instructions. The ring identifies you to me as the designated successor trustee if a contest arose. The key opens a locked cabinet on the property. He said you would understand the contents better than the others." I stared at the photograph again. $4 million. A contest. My name. None of it felt real. The only real thing in the room was the sting of hearing that my mother had already moved to call me a manipulator before she had even called me at all. Eleanor's voice softened a fraction. "Mr. Mercer, your grandfather included one additional sentence for you." She looked down at the page and read it exactly. "He is the only one who ever asked what the silence cost." That one nearly finished me. Eleanor let the quiet sit. Then she said, "The caretaker is expecting you. His name is Lionel Brooks. And Caleb, before you ask, no, I do not yet know how your grandfather acquired the house." Daniel was careful. Very careful. The estate sat on Gaston Street behind an iron gate dark with age and sea air. The brick under my shoes held the afternoon heat. Somewhere nearby, a fountain ran with that low, patient sound water makes when it has been doing the same thing for a century. The house itself rose 3 full stories, its windows tall and narrow, the trim painted so cleanly it looked damp in the light. Lionel Brooks opened the front door before I reached it. He was lean, dark-skinned, maybe late 70s, in a pressed white shirt and tan trousers, his posture straighter than mine despite the cane at his side. "You're Daniel's grandson," he said. "Yes, sir." He gave a single nod. "You've got his eyes when you're tired." Inside, the house smelled of beeswax, old paper, and cool plaster. It was immaculate without feeling staged. A marble fireplace in the front room. Broad pine floors. A dining table long enough for 12, though I could not imagine my grandfather wanting 12 people anywhere near him at once. Lionel led me not to the main parlor but to a smaller study at the back, where the afternoon light came in through green shutters and lay in bands across a roll-top desk. On the far wall hung a framed black and white photograph of Grandad in civilian clothes beside a much younger Lionel. Between them stood a woman I did not know, smiling into the sun. "Daniel bought this place in pieces," Lionel said. "In pieces?" "Roof first, then plumbing, then windows, then the patience to keep going." I touched the back of a leather chair. "He restored all this?" "He funded it. He scrubbed paint with the rest of us when he was in town." I looked around at the room again and felt my understanding of the man begin to split open at the seams. Lionel pointed to a built-in cabinet hidden behind a row of books. "That's what the key is for." The brass key turned with resistance. Inside was a steel lockbox, a brown leather notebook, a folded uniform jacket in plastic, and a small bundle of letters tied with twine. The jacket patch showed the Army insignia. The rank tabs were for Chief Warrant Officer 5. I knew enough to stop breathing for a second. Grandad had always said he was signal support. My mother called him a radio clerk. There are people who say clerk when they mean unimportant, and I lifted the notebook. The leather was cracked at the corners, warm from the room. Inside were pages of neat handwriting, map grids, hand-drawn route diagrams, and short entries dated across years. Some pages had been cut out. Others were marked with initials I did not recognize. Tucked in the back was a photograph. Grandad stood on what looked like a tarmac beside a helicopter. Next to him was an officer in desert camouflage with Colonel's eagles on his chest. On the back of the photo, in Grandad's handwriting, were 6 words. Bell kept them alive. Not me. Did I showed the photo to Lionel. He took longer than I expected before answering. Daniel always said that when something went right. "What happened here?" Lionel shook his head. He never told it straight through. Just pieces. Men came by sometimes. Army men. They never stayed for supper. They'd sit in this room, door shut, talking low. Afterward, Daniel would clean his glasses and say the past had poor manners. I held up the jacket. "Chief Warrant Officer 5? Lionel's expression changed just a little. "Respect. Maybe old anger. Yes. My family said he was administrative support." Lionel looked me dead in the face. "Your family did not ask good questions." That night, I slept in a second-floor bedroom with tall windows cracked to the warm dark. The house creaked like an old ship settling. I sat on the bed with the notebook open in my lap, tracing a route line in faded blue ink that bent around a cluster of small X marks. At the bottom of the page, Grandad had written, "Lantern only works if Bell trusts the relayed." I did not know what lantern was. But I knew it mattered. The next morning, Eleanor called and told me someone from the Army was willing to meet. "Not on the record," she said. "Not yet. Be respectful." "And Caleb?" "Yes. Bring the notebook. Do not surrender it." Colonel Rebecca Sloan met me in a records annex on Fort Stewart, in a windowless conference room that smelled like toner and coffee burned hours ago. She wore the Army Combat Service badge over a pressed uniform and introduced herself with the kind of steady eye contact that makes you instinctively sit straighter. "Colonel Rebecca Sloan, Office of the Judge Advocate General," she said. "I'm here in a liaison capacity." I handed her the photograph, not the notebook. She studied it for 2 seconds and said, "That's Colonel Arthur Bell. Later Command Sergeant Major Arthur Bell, retired." I stood in the upstairs hall of the estate, morning light just beginning to touch the banister. "Who is she?" "Current Commanding General overseeing the doctrinal lineage review attached to the lantern materials." I leaned against the wall. Meaning, Eleanor said, and for the first time I heard something like satisfaction in her voice. "Someone with stars on her shoulders is prepared to explain exactly what your grandfather built, who used it, and why this court is not going to treat him as a confused old man." The final hearing drew more people than a family trust dispute should have. A local reporter had heard enough to become curious. A few veterans sat in the back. Lionel wore a navy blazer, and held his cane like a formal accessory rather than a necessity. My mother came in with Linda and would not meet my eyes. Judge Whitaker called the room to order. Eleanor spoke first.
Calm. Precise.
She laid out the trust, the contested claims, the documentation, the tape, the business record, the military validation. Simon Voss stood and tried one last time to frame Grandad as secretive, erratic, emotionally manipulative. Then Brigadier General Evelyn Shaw took the stand. Even before she spoke, the room understood that something larger than family grievance had entered it. She stated her name, rank, and current command responsibilities. Then she looked at the notebook in the evidence sleeve. "I have reviewed the Daniel Mercer materials now cleared for formal discussion," she said. Those materials establish that Chief Warrant Officer 5 Daniel H. Mercer developed the field relay logic known informally as Lantern after a catastrophic communications failure during combat operations. No one moved, she went on. That logic became the operational foundation for later casualty movement and emergency rerouting systems used by the United States Army and, through civilian adaptation, by major port and disaster response networks afterward. Simon Voss rose. "General, with respect, are you saying this deceased civilian owned the rights to a military system?" She turned to him without changing expression. "I am saying you do not understand what you are trying to reduce." He sat down. General Shaw continued. "Daniel Mercer did not patent Army doctrine. He adapted principles he was later permitted to commercialize in civilian logistics. He did so lawfully. More importantly, he did so after saving American lives with those principles when official channels failed." Then Judge Whitaker asked the question that seemed to lift the air out of the room. "General Shaw, in your professional opinion, was Daniel Mercer suffering from grandiose delusion, as alleged?" She did not hesitate. "No, Your Honor." Her voice cut clean through the room. "He was suffering from having been underestimated." My mother lowered her head. General Shaw then asked permission to read from the Honors Review Board summary. The judge granted it. She read, "Chief Warrant Officer Mercer's improvised command logic during the incident prevented loss of casualty accountability, restored evacuation flow, and directly contributed to the survival of multiple service members. Subsequent doctrinal development confirms his field model as seminal." Seminal. Essential. Foundational. The sort of word history uses when it finally catches up. Then General Shaw did something I will never forget. She stepped down from the witness stand, turned toward me where I sat beside Eleanor, and raised her hand in a formal salute. No one in that courtroom missed what it meant. "This recognition is posthumous," she said, "but respect need not be." My mother made a sound then. Not a sob. Smaller than that. The sound a person makes when something rigid inside finally gives way. Judge Whitaker looked over the bench at the family tables. "The court finds Daniel Mercer acted with full capacity, clear intent, and considerable foresight," he said. "The challenge is dismissed in full." He paused and glanced toward my mother and aunt. "The court cannot order a family to know one another well. It can, however, refuse to reward those who never bothered to try." You could feel the words land. The gavel came down once.
Clean.
Final. Outside the courthouse, reporters drifted toward General Shaw, not me. That felt right. I did not want a camera in my face. I wanted air. Savannah was bright and hot, the pavement throwing up light. Lionel stood beside me on the courthouse steps, one hand on his cane, the other tucked into his jacket. He would have hated the fuss, I said. Lionel smiled faintly. He would have hated the fuss and appreciated the accuracy. My mother came out last. She stopped a few feet away, not close enough to claim intimacy, not far enough to deny relation. Linda kept walking. Simon Voss vanished into the street as if he had urgent business elsewhere. For a moment my mother simply looked at me. Not past me. Not through me. At me. I listened to the tape Eleanor sent. She said, and I nodded. She swallowed. I didn't know he was talking about me too. The sentence hung there.
Small.
Incomplete. Honest, I could have answered a dozen ways. I could have named the years she dismissed him, the years she dismissed me. I could have used the fresh authority of the court like a blade and cut until something bled. I was tired of blades. I said. He was talking about all of us. She looked down at her hands. When I was 10, he missed my school play. He missed 2 birthdays after that. Then he came back with presents and silence and rules. I decided that silence meant he did not care enough to explain himself. I listened. That story got comfortable, she said. I kept telling it. It was not an apology. Not quite. But it was more truth than I had heard from her in years. Over the next few weeks, she did not transform into someone else. Life is less theatrical than that. She still corrected waiters too quickly. Still spoke in judgments before questions. Still flinched when emotion stayed in a room too long. But there were changes. When she visited the estate for the first time after the ruling, she stood in the front hall with both hands on her handbag and asked, "May I see his study?"
May I?
Not I should. Not I deserved. I led her in. She did not touch much. The desk. The window latch. The back of the leather chair. She stared a long time at the photo of Grandad and Lionel. That was taken after the porch was finished. Lionel told her from the doorway. She turned to him. "You knew him better than I did." Lionel, who never wasted words, said, "I knew the parts he brought to work." That seemed to settle somewhere inside her. "You knew that fast. I've reviewed your grandfather's restricted file." The words restricted file sat between us. I asked, "Why was it restricted?" She chose hers carefully. Some assignments remained partially sealed because they involved classified communications methods, foreign assets, and casualty movement during active operations. So my grandfather wasn't a radio clerk. A corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "No, Mr. Mercer. He was not." She slid a thin folder across the table. Most of the pages were blacked out in heavy rectangles.
Dates.
Unit numbers. Evaluation lines. On one page, visible above the redaction, I read, Mercer, Daniel H., CWO5. Exceptional under fire. Mission continuity preserved despite aircraft loss. MY hands went cold. Aircraft loss. Colonel Sloan nodded once. That is all I can confirm in detail at present. Then confirm this much. Was he in combat? Yes. Did he receive commendations? Yes. Did my family know? I can't answer what they knew. I can tell you what he disclosed. Very little. She glanced toward the notebook near my elbow. "What is Lantern?" she asked. "I was hoping you'd tell me." Instead of answering, she sat back. "Your mother's counsel has argued that Daniel Mercer was a confused old man with grandiose fantasies. That argument is about to age badly." I leaned forward before I could stop myself. "Then why not release everything now?" "Because some of it still requires formal review." Her voice stayed even. "And because your grandfather filed specific instructions. He did not want the full record opened unless the trust was challenged in court." Why? Perhaps because he knew exactly who would challenge it. That landed with a dull, private force. She tapped the folder. "There is another matter. A Veterans Foundation was named as contingent beneficiary if the trust failed. The Army has an interest in ensuring Daniel Mercer's intentions are represented accurately." Why would he name a foundation? Colonel Sloan looked at me for a long second. "Because your grandfather was never building a monument to himself. He was building shelter." I drove back to Savannah with that sentence in my head. Building shelter. That afternoon, I took the notebook to Dr. Nina Holloway, a military historian Eleanor recommended. Her office at Georgia Southern's Downtown Research Center was stacked with archival boxes, rolled maps, and enough paper to make the rooms smell like dust and time. Dr. Holloway adjusted her glasses and turned the notebook pages with the care of someone handling bone. "These route sketches are not random," she said. "They're field logistics overlays. For supply, for movement under stress,
Fuel.
casualty evacuation, live rerouting." She pointed at a symbol I had missed. "This notation here suggests communication relays between medevac points. This was not basic support work." I watched her trace one line with a pencil eraser. "Can you tell what war?" "Likely late Cold War into Gulf operations, based on the shorthand. Some of these symbols were used informally before they were standardized." She paused at the back flap where a receipt had been tucked flat. "What's that?" I took it from her. It was old, thermal paper nearly faded away, but one line remained legible. Mercer Signal Systems LLC, my grandfather's name. Accompanied at Dr. Holloway saw my face. You didn't know? No, she leaned back. There were a number of retired communications specialists in the 90s who adapted military routing concepts to civilian shipping and port management. Savannah would make sense. The port here exploded in value. If your grandfather had a stake in the right system early enough, he could buy a house like that. Yes. I thought of the cracked linoleum in Granddad's kitchen, the duct tape on his garden hose, the old truck he drove until the floor rusted through near the pedals. All that money, and he had lived like a man careful not to occupy more world than he needed. Dr. Holloway closed the notebook. There is something else. She opened a reference binder and showed me a trade journal clipping from 1998. The article featured 3 men shaking hands outside a container yard. One was identified as Thomas Kincaid, Chief Operations Officer. Another as James Rudder, Systems Partner. The third man, partly turned away from camera, was named only as D. Mercer, Private Consultant. Under the picture, the article praised an early scheduling architecture that reduced emergency response times at major ports. The diagram reproduced in the margin looked almost identical to the route web in Granddad's notebook, but I whispered, mostly to myself, he built it twice. Dr. Holloway heard me. Maybe. First for war, then for trade. I left her office with photocopies in a folder and the sensation that every answer was splitting into 2 more. That evening, my mother finally called. I heard from Linda that you're in Georgia, she said. I've been here 4 days. She ignored that. You need to stop this. Eleanor Price is stirring up old nonsense. It isn't nonsense. What do you think you're going to prove? I stood in the study with the notebook in my hand. Outside the shutters, cicadas were starting up in the dark. I think Granddad left something real, I said. She let out a breath that sounded like impatience rehearsed over years. Your grandfather liked control. He liked making people chase him. Don't confuse that with depth. Before I answered, I looked at the old photograph of him and Lionel on the wall. Maybe you never stayed long enough to hear him, I said. The line went silent. Then she said very coldly, be careful, Caleb. Contesting family over money changes people. I almost laughed. She still thought the money was the point. A week later, the contest turned from insult to accusation. Eleanor called me into her office and slid over a copy of the filing from my mother's attorney, Simon Voss. It alleged forgery. Not directly, not in neon, but close enough. It suggested I had obtained private documents late in Daniel Mercer's life and cultivated an exclusive dependency relationship for financial gain. I read that phrase twice. Exclusive dependency relationship. There are lies so formal they almost disguise themselves as paperwork. Eleanor said, we expected something aggressive. Breathe before you speak. I visited my grandfather, I said. That's their evidence? That you visited when others did not, she said. And that he trusted you when others had not earned it. I put the filing down because my hands had started to shake. What now? Now we answer with facts. Those facts arrived in the form of Command Sergeant Major Arthur Bell, retired. A few days later, she mailed me a small box. Inside was Granddad's wristwatch, the one with the cracked brown leather strap he wore every Sunday, and beneath it a recipe card in her handwriting. Peach cobbler. His favorite, N.O. note. Just the box that I called her that evening. It got here, I said. She was quiet for a second. Then, the watch always ran 2 minutes fast. He said it made him kinder. I smiled before I meant to. That sounds like him. Another pause. Softer this time. If you want, she said, I can come down next month and help with the kitchen inventory. There may be things in old family papers I still remember. That would help, I said. She exhaled slow. All right. That was our partial peace. Not warm. Not healed. Real. The day I moved in for good, the house was open to a hard blue Georgia sky. Workmen had finished the last exterior stone repair. The garden smelled of wet earth and jasmine. In the upstairs front room, I set Granddad's watch on the mantel and stood in the empty quiet for a long time. A year earlier, I had been told to get out. Now I was home inside a place built by a man no one had bothered to understand until he could no longer answer for himself. That changes the way you think about strength. For most of my life, I had seen strength measured in volume. The person who spoke first. The person who filled the room. The person who made others adjust. Families reward that kind of force because it is easy to identify. It makes noise. It leaves dents. It can be mistaken for leadership by people who have never met the real thing. Granddad taught me something else, though he did it almost entirely without speeches. Strength is not constant display. It is not making everyone witness your burden. It is not winning every room. Sometimes strength is precision. Sometimes it is restraint. Sometimes it is carrying knowledge without turning it into theater. Sometimes it is preparing shelter for people who may never even know your name. He never asked to be remembered. That matters to me. He built systems that saved lives, adapted them into work that created wealth, restored a house most people would have sold for easier money, and then went back to a plain brick home where the coffee tasted burnt and the porch screen rattled in the wind. He did not do that because he lacked imagination. He did it because he understood the difference between possession and stewardship. I think about my mother too, and what families do with silence when they are hurt by it early. We invent meanings. We call privacy rejection. We call discipline coldness. We call modesty lack of ambition. We call the quiet child unserious because he does not advertise his thoughts. We decide too quickly what people are, then spend years defending our first lazy judgment because changing our mind would require humility. That may be the hardest duty of all. Not the salute. Not the courtroom. Not the money. Humility. To admit you misread someone. To admit you preferred a simple story because it excused your distance. To admit a person you dismissed was carrying far more than you could see. Savannah has a way of teaching that if you let it. The city is full of surfaces that look still until the light changes. Brick that turns redder at dusk. Ironwork that seems ornamental until you notice how much weight it holds. Houses that appear graceful from the street and stubborn as old oak at the foundation. Quiet does not mean small. I have walked those rooms enough now to know the phrase belongs to more than one it belongs to anyone who has ever done serious work without audience. Anyone who has ever been called uncertain because they were thoughtful. Anyone who has ever carried a family's misunderstandings with more dignity than the family deserve. If you have someone in your life who speaks less than the others, who does not rush to defend themselves, who seems content to stand half a step back while louder people explain the world, look again. Ask one better question. Stay 1 minute longer in the silence. Some of the strongest people you will ever meet stopped announcing themselves years ago. Quiet does not mean small.